Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the first of the mini lessons for Chapter 13. We're starting off this winter term with spinal cord anatomy. So at the end of 231, we left off with Chapter 12, which was the first chapter in the whole nervous system organization, which we covered neuron anatomy and the physiology of graded and action potentials. So the rest of the material we're going to be covering for the nervous system kind of takes that idea of action potentials and neurons communicating, kind of takes a step back to see how those signals are sent in more organized, kind of larger scale ways, not just from one neuron to one neuron, but like regions of a spinal cord or regions of the brain and what they process and what's information they send out or what kind of information they're receiving, like for the sensory path. So we're going to start first with the anatomy of the spinal cord for this first mini lesson. All right, so let's get going. So the spinal cord itself is about 18 inches long, about a half an inch wide, usually about the thickness of your thumb, gives you a good reference for what we're taking, kind of talking about. And interestingly enough, it does not extend through your entire vertebral column. So if you remember from our bone list, we had our vertebral foramen, which was the big hole in the middle of all the vertebrae. And so when we stack all of the vertebrae, you have that space, that vertebral foramen that's continuous from C1 all the way down through your sacrum even. But the spinal cord structure itself does not continue all the way down to the sacral hiatus. It stops at around L1, L2, and the nerve roots that come off of the spinal cord are what continue through the rest of the lumbar and sacral vertebral foramen and the sacral canal. All right, and I'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. So when we take a look at just the general anatomy, you'll see kind of a repeating pattern, but that pattern is different depending on what part of the spinal cord you are looking at. So if we take a look here, we can see this pattern of kind of like a butterfly shape, H shape, capital H almost, of gray matter surrounded by white matter. But that pattern looks different depending on where you're at. So that was a cervical. Here is the thoracic gray matter. We can see that's quite a bit different. Here's the lumbar gray matter, looks quite a bit different. And then the sacral, right? So they all kind of have that similar shape of kind of being skinny in the middle with these wingy-like things coming off of the sides, but there are some differences in that. And we're going to talk about that as we progress through. So the major organization, if you will, of this gray matter and white matter is the gray matter is centralized, surrounded by the white matter on the outside. That's going to be reversed for the brain, so just keep that in mind. In this first diagram, just kind of this transverse section through the cervical, so C3, they're taking a section right through here, C3 of the spine. We can see the gray matter in the middle, and in the very middle of all of the gray matter, there's an opening. It's a space called the central canal. So the central canal is a hole, basically, that travels all the way through the length of the spinal cord, all the way down to the very tip. And it is continuous with some openings that we'll be learning about in Chapter 14 called brain ventricles. The central canal is filled with what we call cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And we're going to talk more about CSF in the brain chapter, because that's where it's made. We can also see some other directional term kind of landmarks. So here we have an anterior median fissure. So it's on the anterior side of the spinal cord, and it's a fissure, which is like a big groove. And then on the opposite side, we have a posterior median sulcus. Sulcus is like a little groove, right? And then we have some roots coming off. So these are nerve roots. These are axons that are coming out of or going into the spinal cord. We have our posterior or dorsal root and our anterior or ventral root. It is these roots that come together on each side of the spinal cord, your posterior root and your anterior root, combined to produce what's called the spinal nerve. And we're going to get more into this. This is just our first look at it. And then we have a kind of a swollen, lumpy looking structure, kind of smushed in, connected with that posterior root, is called the spinal ganglia, okay, or ganglion. So I will want to mention first of all, if you remember from 231, kind of week one of all of our terminology, we had other words besides posterior and anterior, right? We had dorsal and ventral. Those terms are interchangeable in a lot of different ways. So you might hear me say dorsal median sulcus or dorsal root ganglia or ventral root or ventral median fissure. Those are all fine. Pick one that works with your understanding and use it, as long as you can recognize, if I were to say posterior, that if you're using dorsal, that those mean the same thing. So just keep that in mind when we're labeling all these front and back parts of the spinal cord. All right, so another thing that we can take a look at, so that's our sectional anatomy, is we can look at kind of the gross anatomy. We have these two regions here, the cervical enlargement and the lumbar or lumbosacral enlargement. These are just physical places where the spinal cord is almost looks swollen. It looks bigger, so it's kind of skinny, and then it gets these enlargements and it comes out, and then it gets kind of a little skinny again. The reason why we have enlargements in the cervical and lumbosacral part of the spinal cord is because we have more neurons there. It's physically bigger because there are physically more neurons, because we have extra neurons to control our arms and our legs. We don't need as many neurons in our trunk because we don't have as much stuff there. We don't have as much sensory information coming in or motor commands going out. But in the area of the spinal cord that controls your arms and legs, it's going to be bigger. So that is our cervical enlargement and our lumbar enlargements. Okay, and then the physical end of the spinal cord tapers into what we call the conus medullaris. Okay, conus medullaris right here kind of tapers down to a little point, and that's what ends at around L2, L3 level of the spinal column itself, right? So we can kind of see that right here. Okay. And then the collection of all of these nerve roots, so basically they're those spinal nerves that are extending down into that space, the vertebral foramen or the sacral canal. Collectively, this is what we call the cauda equina. Okay, like it means horse's tail, because apparently it looks like a horse's tail. And then those are the collection of these nerve roots that will then extend out of the holes, the sacral foramen, and then go and innervate the different body parts of your legs and spine and stuff. And then lastly, we have down here at the very end, we have what's called the filum terminale, which is a ligament or extension of the connective tissue, the meninges, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that blend into what's called the coccygeal ligament, which helps to stabilize and support the spinal cord to the coccyx. So it's a stabilizer, this filum terminale and coccygeal ligament. All right. Okay, so I'm just going through the notes here. You guys have these, making sure I'm hitting everything that I see on this particular picture. Okay, so let's move on to the next. Oh, before I move away from this, let's take a look at the naming of the nerve roots real quick. So they have them color-coded. So the blue is the cervical, orange is thoracic, green is lumbar, and pink is sacral. But take a look at this right here. It is called spinal nerve C8. Now, if we think back to our bone list, did we have 8 cervical vertebrae? No, we didn't. 7, 12, and 5, right? So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We had 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar. Now, all of the other ones, 5, and 5 with the sacral, that's what we had before. Why is there a C8? Well, if we take a look at the nerve roots that are actually coming off of the spinal cord, if you'll notice, all of the cervical nerve roots come out above the vertebrae that they're named after. So this first vertebrae right here, that's C1. And so C1 vertebrae, sorry, my dot's wrong, right there. C1 vertebrae has C1 nerve going above it. C2 vertebrae, this guy right here, has C2 going out above it. Now, if we come down to our C8, we have T1. So here's T1 vertebra. I'm going to highlight right here. So that's T1. So I guess we could have called it T1 instead of C8, but then we would have had a T13. Maybe they didn't want to do that because 13 is an unlucky number. Who knows? So it's just a switching in the naming convention of the nerve. So in the cervical spinal nerves, they are named for the bone that is below them. But starting with the thoracic nerves, they are named for the bone that is above them. So we have this C8 is kind of this in between that transition, between that naming convention. So they just call it C8. So if you run into that, that's why. That's the explanation. The other thing I just remembered is the explanation of why your spinal cord does not continue all the way through your lumbar and sacral vertebral foramen. It is because your spinal column, your bones, and your spinal cord are on the same track of development until about the age of 4, right? So 4 years old, your spinal cord goes the full length of your spinal column, your bones. But at about the age of 4, the spinal cord stops growing, but you get taller, right? You're taller than you were when you were age 4. Your vertebral column is larger. So what happens is, as you are slowly growing from age 4 to your adult stature, these nerve roots, you can kind of see them all, they're kind of horizontal here, but then take a look at what happens. They all get really vertical because they were sticking straight out and they've innervated everything, right? You can't pull them back and change because they're all inside your muscles and nerves or tissues and skin and muscle and bone. They're all innervated because that's what's happening when you were developing in utero. When you stop growing at the age of 4, or the spinal cord stops growing at the age of 4, but your spinal column continues, it's slow enough that the nerves can grow and stretch. So that's what the cauda equina is. It's a collection of all of those nerve roots that are coming out of the spinal cord, the sacral segment of the spinal cord, which is way up here. Here's a sacral segment of the spinal cord, but the nerves come out of the sacrum way down here. So they just elongate and they elongate and they elongate. So the length of your spinal cord is as long as it was when you were 4 years old, but your vertebrae just keeps growing. So that's the explanation of why that is. So the naming conventions are a little bit weird, and we have a short spinal cord. Not short like in a bad way, but just it's shorter than the length of a vertebral column. I think that's all the stuff I wanted to mention on this page. Okay, so now we can get into a couple other things that are on the notes that I did not have in the last picture. So we have this word here called a rootlet. Okay, am I still recording? My computer did something funny. So we have this little thing here called a rootlet. So in reality, it's more of these branchy things coming out instead of the nice little tube looking nerve of the ventral root and the dorsal root. They're more collectively called rootlets that then go and blend into the anterior and the posterior roots. If we can see this in lab, I have some beef spinal cords that we'll take a look at that you'll be able to see those rootlets a lot better in that first week of lab. All right, so rootlets. Okay, I think that's the only thing I wasn't able to show you on the last slide. So now we can take a look at meninges. So meninges are the protective sheaths that surround your central nervous system. So we'll see these again in the brain, so we'll focus just now on the ones of your spinal cord, they're called spinal meninges. The outermost connective tissue, it's the toughest, it's thick, it's almost like a hard, not hard, but like a durable plastic wrapping is called dura mater. Dura for tough, and mater is mother. So you have a tough mother surrounding your spinal cord. The middle layer is called arachnoid mater. Arachnoid was called that because it kind of looks like spider webs. So the arachnoid mater. And then the pia means delicate. So we've got a tough mother, a spider webby mother, and a delicate mother protecting and surrounding our spinal cord. And all of this is within your, right, so here's your vertebral foramen. And it extends, so here's your anterior root, here's your dorsal root ganglion, and here's your spinal nerve. So all the things we just looked at up here are just covered and protected by this dura mater and the other meninges. Now, if you can remember back to one of the last things we learned in 231 was peripheral nerve organization. So remember the epineurium, perineurium, endoneurium. That epineurium is going to be continuous with the dura mater. It kind of blends from dura mater to epineurium as those nerves leave the foramen. Okay. If we take a look at this sectional view again with the bone in place, we can see some other features of the meninges and some space and where the CSF is going to be, and a couple other features that were not seen on the other video or the other slides, sorry. So again, here we can find, here's our vertebral spine, right? So that's a landmark. We know the spines are posterior. So we'll just review some of the things we've already looked at. So here's our posterior median fissure or sulcus. Here's our anterior median fissure. Here is our, so this is posterior, right? So here's our posterior root. Here's our anterior root. Here is our spinal ganglion. Sometimes I call it the dorsal root ganglion because that's what they used to call it. And then our anterior root and then our ventral root come together to create the spinal nerve. Oops, sorry. The spinal nerve is actually right here. Okay. So anterior root and dorsal root combine to create the spinal nerve. Something else that we can see that I mislabeled earlier is this spinal nerve is very short. It does not last for a very long time. So you get your dorsal and ventral roots coming together to make the spinal nerve, and then it splits almost immediately after it leaves the vertebral, those intervertebral foramen. It leaves into what's called the ramus. So we have an anterior ramus and we have a posterior ramus. Ramus means branch. Okay, so basically we have dorsal and ventral roots coming together to make the spinal nerve branching into the ramus. Okay, so these are roots. This is the nerve, and these are rami, or ramus. So it's going to be a little bit challenging at first trying to keep those in and keep track of all of these terms, but kind of make sure you're understanding that sequence of the path, because that's going to be very important when we get to chapter 16. So roots coming off of the spinal nerve or spinal cord, they fuse to become the spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve splits into the rami, the anterior and posterior ramus. We also have something, again, that will come back more into play in chapter 16 called the rami communicantes. It is just little pathways or branches that are coming off of the spinal nerve and anterior root, or the anterior ramus. Another thing that we can see here that we didn't in the other view is what's called the denticulate ligament. So at every level of the spinal cord, you have these little connective tissues, kind of extensions of the pia mater coming off and stabilizing the spinal cord laterally. So we had that filum terminal helps to stabilize it longitudinally, connecting to the coccyx at the bottom. And then every level of the spinal cord, basically every level means every vertebra, you're going to have these little denticulate ligaments coming off and stabilizing it so it doesn't shake around laterally within that vertebral column. Okay, so let's take a look at our meninges in this perspective. So again, our dura mater is the outermost layer. And then we have the arachnoid mater, the spider webby looking stuff. And there's this space here. This is a very important space. This is where the CSF is found outside of the spinal cord. It is in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. So this is called SubArachnoid Space because it's below the arachnoid mater. And then we have the pia mater, which covers and follows every curve and fold and sulcus and fissure on the surface of the spinal cord. Another thing I wanted to mention, what do we have here? This guy right here. All of this adipose tissue is padding. It's called the epidural space. So we have subarachnoid, which is below the arachnoid. We have epidural, means outside the dura mater, filled with adipose tissue. So there's a couple medical procedures that take advantage of these spaces. The epidural space is where a doctor and anesthesiologist would inject anesthesia for a spinal block, or an epidural is what it's called, usually seen in women who are going through labor or a surgery of the lower extremities. Basically, the drug goes into this epidural space, diffuses around both the motor and the sensory nerves that are coming in, and gives paralysis as well as sensation blocking. The other procedure that involves some of these spaces is what's called a spinal tap, or a lumbar puncture is a more accurate term. So in that case, I'll get a different color. The needle is going to go through the epidural and go into that subarachnoid space, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a sample of the CSF to analyze it for any sign of infection or other problems. So that also is a procedure that can take place using some of the terms that we saw here. Okay. So what next we're going to take a look at is those gray matter patterns that I was mentioning earlier, right? So it's kind of like this winged looking creature, like a butterfly or a bat or a letter H, or however you see it. This is our gray matter. Now, gray matter, we didn't really define that yet, but we gotta go back a little bit to our anatomy of neurons. So if you remember, I'm going to draw a multipolar neuron like this, right? And it had Schwann cells if it was in the peripheral nervous system, or oligodendrocytes if it was in the central nervous system. This part is not myelinated. It's the cell body. So cell bodies are basically the gray matter. But the myelinated axons, all of those wrappings of the Schwann cells, actually in gross dissection looks gray, or sorry, white, because fats are white. Fatty is kind of white under gross anatomy. So whenever we're talking about gray matter is in reference to where the bulk of the cell bodies are located, and the white matter is the collection of all the myelinated axons. So think of it as the gray matter is a processing center, because that's where all the EPSPs and IPSPs are coming in and summing, where the white matter is just the freeways. These are action potential, thoroughfares where information is just being sent up or down in the particular part of the spinal cord. So when we take a look at the gray matter organization, we start naming some of these nuclei. Think of them as the cell bodies of these neurons that are processing this particular kind of information. We label the gray matter as horns. So we got to identify our posterior sulcus, our anterior fissure. And so once we have our front and back down, we can say this is our posterior horn, our anterior horn, and then laterals on the side. And lateral gray horns are only found in the thoracic and lumbar sections of the spinal cord. We're going to see that more in chapter 16. So of the posterior horn, okay, so posterior horn only, right? So posterior horn only has sensory information. This is sensory information coming into the spinal cord. It only processes sensory information. Okay. And then somatic and visceral. So here's these words. We saw them at the very beginning of chapter 12. Somatic means like conscious. Visceral means unconscious. So whatever you need to do to learn those, because we're going to need those words really good for these first three chapters. So when we talk about somatic sensory, it is the sensory information that you are consciously aware of. So poking, pulling your hair, visual, no, not visual, because that's something different. So just information that's coming in from your body into your spinal cord that you are consciously aware of. Temperature, pain, pressure, light touch, those types of things. Visceral is sensory information that you are unaware of. So you are not aware of the blood pressure that's happening in the blood vessels of your arm. There's sensory information that's coming in. It's being processed by your CNS, but you are just not aware of it. So that's your visceral sensory. So somatic sensory is what you are aware of. Visceral sensory is what you are not aware of, but it's still sensory information coming into the spinal cord. Then we take a look at the anterior horn. That's kind of this pink bit right there. And if we take a look, it's got the word somatic. So again, somatic is conscious, but instead of sensory, it's motor. Motor is muscle, right? Or your effectors, things that can do stuff. The only somatic motor effector that we have is skeletal muscle. That's it. So whenever we are sending out somatic motor commands, that command only goes to skeletal muscle, and that's it. But what about all the other things that we can control? Well, think about it. What other things can you consciously control besides your thoughts? Those aren't effectors. Can you consciously control your smooth muscle? No. Can you consciously control your cardiac muscle? No. Can you consciously control the secretion of your glands? No. Can you consciously control the breaking down of fat in your adipose tissue? No, you can't. So the only thing that you have conscious control over are those skeletal muscles. Remember all those skeletal muscles you learned back in 231? That's it. That's all you have conscious control over. The cell bodies that control those are located in that anterior horn. Okay. Well, what about all those other things we can't control? So the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, the glands, the adipose tissue. Well, that is going to be our visceral motor. Okay, so that's in the middle here in these lateral gray horns. So visceral motor are going to be motor neurons that are going to be sending out commands to control your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue fat breakdown. All right, so this is the organization of gray matter in your spinal cord. Of your posterior horns is purely sensory, lateral horns is visceral motor, anterior horns is somatic motor. Okay, and then our columns, the white columns here, we just are labeling them directionally. So we have posterior white columns, lateral white columns, and anterior white columns. All righty. Okay. Chapter 15 goes into more detail about the organization of the white columns. We are not covering chapter 15, so you don't need to know that. Really, the takeaway is knowing where they're located, right? Posterior, lateral, anterior white columns, and then just knowing that they are going to contain ascending for information going up and descending for information being sent out to your body tracks. So collections of axons in the spinal cord are called tracks. So ascending tracks and descending tracks will be information going up and down in your columns, posterior, lateral, and anterior white columns. Okay. And then just finishing off with a micrograph. So you can kind of see a lot of the structures we took a look at in a slice of a spinal cord under the microscope. So I'm not going to go over this, but you can just take a look at it. I think it is from your textbook. Use it as a practice, to quiz, to learn, and review your anatomy of the spinal cord. All right, I know that was a long first lesson, so thank you for sticking through, and I will see you next time. Bye.